Close your eyes for a moment.
Who built Europe's
Imagine a
first
world
great
where gods walk
civilization?
among men, where the sea is
Then,
both road and
without
grave,
warning,
where bronze swords
the
decide
sea
the
turned
fate of
against them.
empires. This is the world of ancient Greece. Not a quiet place, dusty statues and textbook dates, but a living, breathing civilization that burned brighter than almost anything that came before. It began long before Athens, long before Sparta.
One woman
long
would
before
soon
philosophers
ignite the
argued
most
the sun
famous
was
war in
worthless.
history.
It began on a beautiful island in the middle of the sea, where a people built something so extraordinary that historians still struggle to explain how they did it. These were the Minoans, Europe's first great civilization. They built towering palace complexes on the island of Crete as early as 3000 BC, trading with Egypt, crafting art of breathtaking beauty, and sailing the Mediterranean with confidence no European culture had ever shown before. Their greatest palace, Knossos, sprawled across acres of land, multi-storied, painted in vivid colors, plumbed with running water thousands of years before the Romans. They worshipped a goddess. They kept detailed records. They created. And for centuries, they flourished. No army challenged them. No enemy touched them. The sea was their shield. But the sea had another plan entirely. Sometime around 1600 BC, the island of Thera, just north of Crete, exploded. Not a small eruption. Not the kind that fills the sky with smoke and fades by morning. This was one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in recorded human history. The mountain tore itself apart. The blast was heard thousands of miles away. A wall of ash choked the sky across the Aegean, blocking sunlight, poisoning crops, and turning the sea itself into a weapon. Tsunamis, some historians believe, crashed into Crete's northern coastline with terrifying force. The Minoan harbors, where their great trading ships once docked, vanished beneath the waves. Their crops failed. Their palaces burned. Their trade networks collapsed. No one fully understands why the Minoans disappeared so completely after centuries of dominance. But the eruption of Thera cracked their world beyond repair. By 1450 BC, the great palace at Knossos lay in ruins. The people who had built Europe's first civilization faded from history like a dream. They left behind painted walls, clay tablets no one could fully read, and the ghost of something magnificent. The sea that had protected them had swallowed them whole. But even as the ashes settled over Crete, warriors on the Greek mainland were watching and waiting. While the Minoans faded, a different civilization was rising on mainland Greece. The Mycenaeans, fierce, ambitious, heavily armed, built a world of warrior kings and fortified citadels. Their cities sat on high rocky hills, surrounded by walls so massive that later Greeks would say giants must have built them. Mycenae itself, their greatest city, guarded its entrance with the famous Lion Gate, two carved stone lions watching every road in and out. The Mycenaeans were not builders of beautiful, peaceful palaces. They were conquerors. They absorbed Minoan culture, borrowing their art, their writing system, even their trade routes. But everything they touched became harder, sharper, more militaristic. They sailed across the Mediterranean not to trade peacefully, but to take. They raided coasts, seized goods, and left destruction in their wake. Their kings were powerful beyond anything Greece had seen, buried in shaft graves filled with golden death masks, weapons, and treasures. Yet for all their military strength, it was not a war over land or resources that would make the Mycenaeans truly famous. It was something far more dangerous, something human, something irrational, a woman, a stolen bride, a promise of war that 10,000 warriors would sail across the sea to keep. One woman was about to ignite the most famous war in history. Her name was Helen, Queen of Sparta, said to be the most beautiful woman in the known world. When a Trojan prince named Paris took her to his city, it set off a chain of events that changed everything. Whether Helen went willingly or was taken by force, history has never fully agreed. But the Greek kings had made a vow, a sacred oath, to defend whoever married Helen. So Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, called every warrior king to sail. Achilles, the greatest fighter alive. Odysseus, the cleverest man in Greece. Ajax, enormous and fearless. Thousands of ships filled with bronze-armored soldiers crossed the Aegean Sea and pulled onto the beaches of Troy around 1200 BC. What followed was 10 years of brutal, grinding warfare. The walls of Troy were strong. The Trojans would not break. The Greeks attacked again, and again they were pushed back. Men died, friendships fractured. Achilles, the greatest warrior in the Greek army, refused to fight after a quarrel with Agamemnon over honor, a decision that nearly cost the Greeks the war entirely. Troy held. The war dragged on, 10 years of blood for a city they could not take, until one man had an idea so simple, so perfectly deceptive, it seems impossible it worked. The plan was Odysseus's. He was not the strongest fighter, he was not the bravest, but he was the cleverest man in any room, and it was cleverness that finally broke Troy. The Greeks built a massive wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to conceal a force of elite warriors. Then they did the unthinkable. They sailed their ships away. They left. The Trojans looked out from their walls at an empty beach, a deserted Greek camp, and one enormous wooden horse standing alone in the sand. A fake deserter, a Greek spy, told them it was an offering to the goddess Athena. Bringing it inside the city, he claimed, would make Troy invincible. The Trojans argued. One priest, Laocoon, begged them not to trust it. "I fear the Greeks," he warned, "even when they bring gifts." But his warning was ignored. The horse was dragged through the gates of Troy. The city celebrated. They feasted, drank, and sang, convinced their war was finally over. That night, in the deepest darkness, the Greek warriors hidden inside the horse climbed silently out. They opened Troy's gates. The Greek fleet, which had only sailed to a nearby island, returned. By morning, Troy was burning. The greatest city in the ancient world was gone. But its fall would trigger something no one had predicted. The collapse came from everywhere at once. After the fall of Troy, something went terribly wrong across the entire ancient world. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, one of history's greatest mysteries. Around 1200 BC, not just Greece, but civilizations across the entire eastern Mediterranean began to fall apart simultaneously. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces burned. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, great cities that had dominated the region for centuries, were destroyed and abandoned. Trade networks that had connected Greece to Egypt and the Middle East simply stopped. The writing system the Mycenaeans had used vanished completely. Population numbers collapsed, people abandoned cities and returned to scattered village life. Historians still debate why. Some point to invaders, mysterious sea peoples who appeared in ancient Egyptian records as unstoppable raiders. Others suggest drought, earthquake, or internal rebellion, perhaps all of it at once. The world of warrior kings and golden graves was over. For the next 400 years, Greece entered a period so quiet, so stripped of its former complexity, that historians call it the Greek Dark Ages. No palaces, no trade records, no written language, just small, struggling communities clinging to survival. The world of heroes had vanished. Greece had gone dark. But in the darkness, something new was beginning to stir. Slowly, painfully slowly, life returned to Greece. By around 800 BC, villages grew into towns. Towns grew into something entirely new, the polis, or city-state. Unlike anything the ancient world had seen before, the Greek city-state was not just a city. It was an idea, a community of citizens who saw themselves not as subjects of a king, but as members of something they had built together. Each polis had its own laws, its own government, its own identity. Athens sat in the region of Attica, growing powerful on olive oil, pottery, and trade. Corinth controlled vital land routes between northern and southern Greece, becoming enormously wealthy. Thebes dominated the fertile plains of Boeotia. And in the southern region of the Peloponnese, a city unlike any other was being built, not through trade or philosophy or culture, but through something far more brutal. Each city-state had its own character, its own pride, its own way of doing things. Greeks shared a language and worshipped the same gods, yet they fought one another constantly, over land, over water, over honor. These city-states would produce democracy, drama, architecture, and philosophy. But they would also produce rivalries so fierce they would one day tear Greece apart. For now, though, two rivals were rising above the rest, and their differences could not have been more total. In the southern region of the Peloponnese, a civilization was building itself from the ground up, and the material it used was human suffering. Sparta was unlike anything Greece had ever produced. At around age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their mothers and placed into a brutal military training system called the agoge. They trained barefoot in every season. They were deliberately underfed, taught to steal food, and beaten not for stealing, but for getting caught. They slept on rough reeds. They fought one another constantly. By the time a Spartan boy became a man, he was something closer to a weapon than a person. Spartan women trained too, running, wrestling, throwing javelins, because a strong mother, the Spartans believed, produced strong soldiers. The entire state existed for one purpose: war, to be the finest fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. And it worked. The Spartan phalanx, rows of soldiers locked behind overlapping shields, spears extending forward like a wall of iron, became the most feared military formation in Greece. No city wanted to face them. No city wanted to fight them. Sparta grew to dominate the entire Peloponnese, forcing neighboring peoples into slavery to work the land while Spartan citizens trained. They were invincible on land. But while Sparta sharpened swords, Athens was doing something very different. Athens was asking questions. Around 508 BC, a remarkable thing happened. An Athenian reformer named Cleisthenes pushed through a set of political changes so radical they had no real precedent in the ancient world. He called it demokratia, rule by the people. Citizens, free male Athenians, would vote on laws, debate policy, and hold real power in how their city was governed. No king decided alone. No single strongman held absolute authority. The crowd decided. It was imperfect, deeply limited by modern standards. Women, slaves, and foreigners were entirely excluded. But as a concept, it was revolutionary. Athens didn't stop there. Its schools, its theater, its architecture, its philosophy, all pushed boundaries no civilization had yet crossed. Poets competed at public festivals. Architects raised buildings of extraordinary beauty. Citizens argued, challenged, and debated in the open air. A city was being shaped not by the strength of its army, but by the power of its ideas. And those ideas attracted brilliant people from across the Greek world, drawn to Athens like moths to a flame. Athens was reaching for something extraordinary. It was becoming the intellectual center of the known world. But even as the city dreamed of greatness, a shadow was falling from the east, a shadow so massive it covered the entire Aegean Sea. The Persian Empire was the largest the ancient world had ever seen. It stretched from the borders of India to the edges of Egypt, a civilization of hundreds of millions, commanded by one man, the great king. Under Darius I and then his son Xerxes, Persia had conquered nation after nation, absorbing every people it encountered. Now it turned its eyes west toward the small, quarrelsome city-states of Greece. From Persia's perspective, the Greek cities were barely worth noticing. Tiny, divided, constantly at war with one another. Easy. In 490 BC, Darius sent a massive force across the Aegean to punish Athens for supporting a rebellion against Persian rule. The Persians landed at Marathon, just 26 miles from the city. The Athenians sent a runner named Phidippides to beg Sparta for help. Sparta refused to march immediately. Religious custom made them wait. Athens stood nearly alone. What happened next shocked the entire ancient world. The Athenians charged. They ran at the Persian line, an almost unbelievable act of aggression against a superior force. The Persians, confused by the speed of the assault, broke and fled to their ships. Athens had won. Against one of history's greatest empires, a single Greek city had stood firm. But Persia's humiliation only deepened its ambition. Darius died vowing revenge. His son Xerxes would try again, with an army so vast it seemed to darken the earth beneath its feet. In 480 BC, Xerxes led an army estimated in the millions. Ancient sources may exaggerate, but the scale was genuinely staggering, toward Greece. The Greek city-states, for once, united in something approaching common defense. But unity was imperfect, and time was short. Someone had to slow the Persian advance while the Greek fleet prepared. A narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae was chosen as the choke point. Commanding the Greek defense was Leonidas, king of Sparta. He brought 300 of his finest warriors. Other Greeks joined, perhaps 7,000 total. But the Spartans would become the legend. For 2 days, the Greeks held the pass against impossible odds. The Persians, unable to use their superior numbers in the narrow space, fell by the thousands. Wave after wave broke against the Greek shields. Xerxes reportedly watched in disbelief. Then a traitor, a Greek named Ephialtes, showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass. Leonidas learned his position was about to be surrounded. He sent most of the Greek forces away to fight another day. He kept his 300. They turned to face the entire Persian army, knowing exactly what was coming. They died to the last man. But their stand sent a message through every Greek city that felt the ground shake beneath Persian feet. We do not break. And the war was not over. The Greeks needed a miracle. They found one on water. Themistocles, an Athenian general of extraordinary strategic genius, had long believed that Athens' future lay not in land armies but in naval power. He had convinced Athens to build a massive fleet of fast, powerful warships called triremes. Now, as Persia occupied Athens and burned the Acropolis, Themistocles drew the Persian fleet into a trap. The narrow strait near the island of Salamis was his chosen battlefield. In tight waters, the enormous Persian fleet, built for open sea domination, could not maneuver properly. Greek triremes, smaller and faster, crashed into the Persian ships, ramming hulls, tangling oars, pulling sailors to their deaths in the cold sea. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on shore as his fleet collapsed around him. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BC was one of the most consequential naval engagements in history. Persia's invasion never recovered. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, a united Greek land force crushed the remaining Persian army. Xerxes retreated. Greece had survived. A tiny collection of quarrelsome cities had turned back the greatest empire on earth. And what came next? What Athens built in the decades immediately following was perhaps the most extraordinary cultural explosion any civilization has ever produced. Greece had survived the storm. Now it would build its cathedral. After defeating Persia, Athens entered an age so extraordinary that historians gave it a special name, the Golden Age. Under the leadership of Pericles, a statesman of rare vision and intelligence, Athens rebuilt itself into the most beautiful, culturally rich city in the ancient world. The Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena, built entirely of white marble on the high rock of the Acropolis, was constructed between 447 and 432 BC, with a mathematical precision that modern engineers still marvel at. Its columns appeared perfectly straight by being very slightly curved, because the human eye perceives truly straight lines as bowing inward. It was architecture designed with the viewer's perception in mind. Below the Parthenon, Athens hummed with life. Sculptors created figures so lifelike they seemed to breathe. Playwrights composed tragedies and comedies performed before thousands of citizens in open-air theaters. Historians like Herodotus and Thucydides invented the practice of recording events critically and accurately. The city attracted poets, artists, scientists, and thinkers from across the Greek world. Athens became a magnet for brilliance. It was the center of everything. Its influence spread through every corner of Greek civilization like sunlight through open water. But there was a cost. Wealth, power, and influence created something else too, something darker. Athens was growing proud, and its neighbors were watching with narrowing eyes. In the streets of Athens, a man walked who wore no special clothes, owned almost no property, and never wrote a single word. Yet Socrates would become one of the most influential human beings who ever lived. His method was simple. Ask questions, relentlessly, patiently, uncomfortably. He would stop craftsmen, politicians, and generals in the agora, the public marketplace, and ask them to explain what they believed. What is justice? What is courage? What is knowledge? And almost always, under the pressure of his questioning, the person being asked would discover they didn't truly understand what they had claimed to know. Socrates called this the beginning of wisdom, knowing what you don't know. His student Plato took this further, writing dialogues that explored everything from the nature of the soul to the ideal structure of government. Plato's student Aristotle went further still, systematically studying biology, physics, ethics, logic, and politics with a rigor that laid foundations for Western science and philosophy. In just a few decades, in one small city, 3 men redefined how humanity thought about itself. Their ideas spread outward from Athens like ripples on water, reaching every corner of the Greek world and eventually every corner of the modern world, too. But even as Athens philosophized, war was gathering at its gates, and this time the enemy was not Persia. The war between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, began in 431 BC and lasted 27 devastating years. It was not a war born of sudden crisis. It grew slowly out of fear and jealousy. Sparta and its allies watched Athens grow richer, more powerful, and more dominant with every passing year. Corinth complained that Athens was strangling its trade. Sparta feared Athens was rewriting the balance of power in Greece. The tension had been building for decades. When it finally broke, it broke completely. Two very different visions of Greece went to war. Sparta, land-based, militaristic, conservative, communal. Athens, sea-based, commercial, democratic, individualistic. The war was brutal and complicated. Sparta could not easily take Athens, whose long walls connected the city to its port. Athens could not defeat Sparta on land, so both sides attacked what the other valued most. Sparta ravaged the Athenian countryside every summer. Athens raided coastal cities loyal to Sparta. And then in 430 BC, a plague struck Athens. Devastating, mysterious, unstoppable. It killed roughly 1/4 of Athens' population. It killed Pericles himself. With him went the steadiest hand in Athenian politics. What came after was worse than the disease. Poor decisions, failed military campaigns, betrayal, and slow grinding exhaustion. Greece was tearing itself apart from the inside. By 404 BC, Athens had lost. Sparta stood victorious. But the victory was hollow. 30 years of constant warfare had not produced a stronger Greece. It had produced an exhausted one. Sparta's attempt at Greek leadership quickly became tyranny, and resistance grew. Thebes, the third great city of Greece, rose to challenge Spartan dominance in the decades that followed. Under the brilliant general Epaminondas, Thebes shattered Sparta's myth of invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. The Spartan phalanx, for 2 centuries the most feared formation in Greece, broke. Spartan power collapsed almost overnight. But Thebes' dominance lasted barely a generation. Epaminondas died in battle in 362 BC, and with him went Theban greatness. Greece was left leaderless, fragmented, and worn down by a century of war. City-states quarreled over scraps of influence, alliances formed and dissolved in seasons. The population was exhausted. The treasury of every major city was strained to breaking. The great experiment in city-state civilization was faltering. Nobody could unite Greece from within. Too much blood had been spilled between these cities. Too many old wounds festered. And so while the Greeks argued, drained, and diminished one another, a kingdom in the north, one the Greeks had always dismissed as half-barbarian, had been watching patiently, learning from every Greek mistake. A king was preparing his move. Philip II of Macedonia was not supposed to matter. Macedonia sat in the northern reaches of the Greek world, rural, less culturally refined, looked down upon by Athens and Sparta alike. But Philip was one of the sharpest military minds of his age. He had spent time in Thebes as a young man and studied the military genius of Epaminondas closely. He came home and transformed the Macedonian army completely. He lengthened the traditional Greek spear into a terrifying weapon called the sarissa, 18 feet of iron-tipped wood that gave his phalanx a reach no enemy formation could match. He combined this infantry formation with devastating cavalry attacks, creating an army that operated as one fluid, lethal machine. Then he turned south. One by one, Greek city-states fell under Macedonian influence, some by force, some through diplomacy, some through bribery. Athens resisted loudest, led by the orator Demosthenes, who warned his city again and again that Philip was a mortal danger. Few listened in time. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip crushed the allied Greek forces. Greece, the birthplace of democracy and philosophical freedom, passed under the control of a Macedonian king. But Philip never got to enjoy his triumph. He was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding in 336 BC. His son stepped forward. He was 20 years old, and he would change the world. Alexander had been educated by Aristotle himself, the greatest mind of the age, tutoring the most ambitious conqueror history would ever produce. By the time he took the Macedonian throne at 20, Alexander had already fought in battle, already shown brilliance beyond his years. He moved with breathtaking speed. He secured Greece, crushed a rebellion in Thebes so completely the city was leveled as a warning, and then crossed into Asia. What followed over the next 11 years was almost incomprehensible in its scale and speed. Alexander defeated Persia's massive armies again and again, at the Granicus River, at Issus, at Gaugamela, despite being consistently outnumbered. He freed the cities of Asia Minor. He entered Egypt and was declared a god. He burned Persepolis, the Persian capital, in 330 BC, revenge at last for Xerxes burning Athens 150 years before. He pushed east into Central Asia, then into India, fighting all the way to the edges of the known world. His soldiers, loyal beyond reason, exhausted beyond endurance, finally refused to march further. Alexander wept, it is said, because there were no more worlds to conquer. He began planning his return, dreaming of new campaigns, new cities, new victories. He had never lost a single battle. He was 32 years old. And then in Babylon in 323 BC, Alexander the Great fell ill and died. No one was ready. Alexander had built the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to the borders of India, and he had never named a successor. When asked on his deathbed who should inherit his empire, he reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." It was almost a curse. His generals, brilliant, ambitious, utterly devoted to him but utterly unable to agree, tore the empire apart over the next 40 years in wars called the Wars of the Diadochi, meaning successors. They were brutal, prolonged, and completely destructive of everything Alexander had unified. By the end, the empire had split into several large kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Persia and the Middle East, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and Greece. Greek culture spread across these territories in what historians call the Hellenistic Age. Greek language, Greek art, Greek ideas flowing outward to every corner of the known world. But Greece itself, the homeland, the birthplace of everything, was smaller and weaker than ever. The great city-states that had once dared to hold off Persia were now just pieces on a much larger board. And a new power was rising in the West, growing stronger with every decade. A republic built on hills overlooking the Tiber River, learning from everyone it encountered. Rome came slowly, then all at once. For decades, Roman influence crept eastward as Rome defeated Carthage and expanded across the Mediterranean. Greek cities were drawn into Roman politics, whether they wanted to be or not. Some allied with Rome voluntarily, hoping for protection. Others resisted and paid the price. In 146 BC, the same year Rome leveled Carthage, Roman legions crushed the Greek city of Corinth so completely they left it as rubble and salt. Greece became a Roman province, the world's first democracy, the birthplace of philosophy, the civilization that had given humanity the Parthenon, the Olympics. Tragedy and comedy, geometry and logic was now governed by Roman magistrates. And yet, Rome carried Greece inside it. Roman intellectuals learned Greek. Roman architecture borrowed Greek columns and proportions. Roman philosophy grew from Greek roots. Roman religion adapted Greek gods. The ideas that had been born in the Athenian agora, in the schools of Plato and Aristotle, in the mind of Socrates, kept moving through Rome, into the medieval world, into the Renaissance, into the Enlightenment, into the democratic revolutions that shaped the modern age. The armies of Greece were defeated, the city-states were gone, but Greek ideas outlived every empire that followed. Ancient Greece fell in 146 BC, yet more than 2,000 years later, in our courts, our schools, our governments, our theaters, our science, its voice still echoes through the world.